Good evening and welcome. We're just waiting for people to get online. I can see by the numbers that people are joining us, so thank you for your patience. We get started in just 30 seconds. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Dual Reality part of our webinar series. On behalf of Next Generations and the Now for Holocaust Survivors Initiative at Morse Life Health System, I welcome you to yet another of our live webinars. Tonight, we have 145 registered. My name is Jenny Frummer, and I'm the director of the Now for Holocaust Survivors Initiative, and I work closely with Next Generations as the director of strategic initiatives. A few words about your host organizations. Next Generations is committed to educating all ages about the lessons of the Holocaust and to mitigating anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hate by promoting respect and teaching the skills of how to be an upstander and not be a bystander. We also are committed to supporting Holocaust survivors and their offspring, the second, third, and fourth generations, or the next generations of family survivors. We are obligated to support the authentic voices of survivor families. The Now for Holocaust Survivors Initiative provides Holocaust services in the Palm Beach County area. We work with local organizations and offer additional supplemental and expanded services to Holocaust survivors and their families. Regardless of the care a survivor may already be eligible to receive through the generous grants of the Claims Conference allocated to Jewish Family Services, all survivors and their family members may receive additional services paid for by the Now Initiative. A unique feature of this program is the vast array of services available through Morse Life, which includes familiar traditional community-based and in-home care services, as well as palliative care, hospice services, both in-home and on-site. Other critical services such as respite care, rehabilitation, memory care, skilled care, assisted living, and independent living communities are also offered on the Morse Life campus. The Now Initiative is fully embedded in a comprehensive health system delivery services of Morse Life, which is a premier organization providing services to older adults. This webinar series is partially funded by a grant from the Jewish Federations of North America and the Center for the Advancement of Holocaust Survivors Care. Remember that all of our webinars are presented live, and we're so fortunate to have Dr. Felsen share her extensive experience, insights, and research in working with Holocaust survivors and their families. We are forever grateful to you. Just a few housekeeping items before we proceed. All participants are muted with your cameras turned off. We cannot see any of you on camera. We are in broadcast mode. We will also not be able to hear any of you during the presentation. So one way to communicate with me and the panel is through the chat feature and or the Q&A feature. And during the webinar, I'll try and respond as best I can. We also will include 4 polls. These are questions, and you are requested to select a response. A screen called a poll, some of you are very familiar with this at this point, will pop up, and you can respond directly on the poll card. As for the format of today's webinar, Dr. Felsen will present for about 55 to 60 minutes, after which I will facilitate a Q&A session for about 15 minutes. Please type your questions anytime during the presentation, preferably in the Q&A box, which will open when you click on the Q&A icon. The webinar will be recorded, but will not be available until the end of the series. If you have any information, any questions, or need information on continuing credit, please just let me know. Tomorrow you will receive an email link with an evaluation. We really encourage you, please, to respond to that. It won't take more than 2 or 3 minutes. Dr. Felsen's bio, along with the other presenters through this showcase, are available on the website. One last item. When you register for future webinars, your confirmation email will be sent to you by Rabbi Erica Rosenkrantz. She is part of our team together with Martine, our IT professional. Please save this link so that you will not have a problem signing on to a webinar. So I welcome you all. I have a special shout out to colleagues from Jewish Family Services and also those joining us from the network of Jewish Human Service Agencies. And now, as always, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Irit Felsen.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you very much, Dr. Frumer. It's really a great pleasure to be with everyone, with you and everyone this evening again. As some of you know, we focus each time on a different topic, and yet there are, of course, certain pieces that are like links, sort of like links in a chain that appear in the different conversations and connect between them. Although, as I said, the focus of each is on a particular topic. So today we'll talk about what I call the dual reality of survivors and their children. But before we start, we would like to ask you to let us know who you are. So here is the first question. Please check what best describes you. Really welcome. So we'll go to the next slide. We have three more questions, which we kind of bunched in the beginning to see what you think about this, and then we'll proceed. Okay, so looks like the majority, perhaps around 68, 70% believe that our responses are a little bit different to COVID-19 and everything that's going around alongside COVID-19, a little different than other people. Good. Can we go to the next one, Jenny? Yes. Yeah. Are we getting the next poll? Do you believe the trauma can be inherited? Yeah. So many of you, 85% believe that it can, and a small percent is not sure. Okay, great. And the last question then, if I may, yes. Right. Have you ever considered you personally may have been trauma exposed because of your own family Holocaust experience? Yeah. So a very high rate of yeses. Okay, great. Thank you so much. It just, I think, gives us a little sense of how the people that are with us this evening, how we feel, how this group feels about these things. And I will, oh, I forgot, there's another one. No, that's the one, right, that's the one. So as many of you know, I feel very much the need these years as the survivors disappear and pass away, to start my presentations with the only picture, only photograph that I have of my parents' families. It's one photograph that remained of my father's family, because it was sent to one of the sisters who was already outside of Poland. And that's the only photograph I have of my dad's family. And there is none left of my mother's, which was a great source of pain for her. So we, second generation, I am not unique in that. Some people have not even one photograph. We, in addition to the fact that we lost our parents' families and our extended families, we have no heirlooms, we have no photographs. And I remember how when I went to work for the Israeli government in Hamburg in Germany, I rented an apartment in the little house, this charming little house of an old lady who first told me that she was a child during the Holocaust and didn't know anything about it. And then since I lived there for 4 years, you know, truth comes out, and she actually was already a married woman. And she showed me, she had this beautiful vitrine, as they were called, you know, these glass cabinets with all kinds of objects, china objects and all kinds of other things that dated back to her great-great-grandfather, who did business with the Russian Tsar. And I remember standing there in front of this vitrine, looking at these objects with just feeling petrified, just petrified with awe at the fact that people can have things that belong to their great-great-grandfather, and they can be looking at these objects and passing them on to their children. She had a daughter my age. We had, of course, nothing. Mariana Hirsch, the scholar, suggests that photography is one of the main instruments by which families preserve and perpetuate the memory, the family memory. And for us, children of survivors, in the absence of the generation of grandparents, most of us had none, and so many relatives that are not there. And in the context of the refugee experience, which is, you know, most of our parents immigrated either to the United States, Canada, South Africa, Israel. This loss of heirlooms and photographs is an additional loss of a whole layer of cultural and generational linkage to the generations of our family before us. So I wanted to talk a little bit, and I wanted to place our conversation today closely in the context of what we're living through right now, which is the COVID pandemic, and also really the coalescing various crises that followed in its wake, the social and political, the economical crises that followed the pandemic itself. And I think that what we're doing right now, which is kind of a second best web-based way of being together, is a very, very important thing that we're doing for ourselves at this time. It's much more than just any webinar, in my opinion, because we're all living in this together. And as I can tell you right now, also from a study that I just completed conducting with my colleague, Professor Amit Shrira from Israel, we did a study in which many of you were kind enough to agree to participate, and you filled out our questionnaires, which were quite extensive. And I really thank those of you who did it for your time. And we found out that there is a large group of second generation who definitely feel many more symptoms of depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms in comparison to people who are not children of survivors, and in comparison to those of us who feel that their parents integrated well and did not have significant post-traumatic symptoms by the time they were raising their children. And the interesting thing is, though, that there's a very large group amongst us who feel much more lonely during the time of COVID and social distancing, because and that is in despite the fact that they describe that they have the same amount of social support around them and the same amount of the same level of contact with their social support, be it children, friends, relatives, colleagues, and so forth. So we have a sensitivity to feeling more lonely, and we have a sensitivity, many of us have a sensitivity to feeling much more psychologically distressed by everything that's happening right now, even though we do not have more intense worries about COVID itself, about contracting the illness or someone close to us getting it, because as a rule, I think we are fairly well protected, being that we don't have to be outside working, we don't have to, be very exposed to it. So being together in any way which is possible, especially with other people who might be particularly personally relevant to us, because children of survivors don't always feel comfortable sharing our unique experiences with others, because we feel that we have a different flavor. And I will talk a lot more about those different flavors of our experiences in general and in relation to COVID. So that's one reason why I think it's particularly important to find ways to be together, to find ways to be together with other 2Gs, so that one doesn't feel that sense of isolation, which apparently we feel even with friends and relatives who are not sharing our reactions to COVID. And also in order to tap into the big think tank, as it's called in coaching language, with regards to hearing how others who are relevant to us, others who are second generation too, are coping and adapting to these various novel challenges that we're all facing, and also to normalize and recalibrate our individual reactions to what we're all living through. So what we're living through, this reality of the pandemic, is really very different. It's a new reality. Everything about life as we knew it is different. And this time there are some threats that are real, threat of getting the illness and dying, prolonged separation from family and friends. We don't know how long it will be that this kind of a life will continue. Uncertain future on many levels, potential for social and political crisis, both globally and in the United States, and the rise in anti-Semitism, which was quite sharp and quite well noticed in the recent times, including also, of course, in other places, as late as the one in Quebec just now. We also went through a period of some scarcity and worries about the fact that it would be difficult to access certain services or certain, getting certain products, toilet paper being, of course, a famous one in the beginning months. And the sales of firearms increased, skyrocketed, in fact, not just increased in the first months of the coronavirus, which for us are this is a very triggering fact, as was the news coverage about police brutality, about racism, images of the shattered glass in the streets in some places at some points that were very reminiscent, many of us, of Kristallnacht, the night in which about 7,500 Jewish stores were destroyed and about 400 synagogues were burnt down, and also the inflammatory and hate inciting political speeches that have been strewn all around. All of these are things that happen over the last few months, in addition to the pandemic itself, all of which are very loaded for us. However, one should make no assumptions about the reactions of survivors of the Holocaust, nor their children. And even though there were so many potential triggers for 2G, the exposure to trauma in survivors, as well as the exposure to secondary trauma by their children, has both a sensitizing as well as an inoculating influence on survivors as well as on children of survivors. So we know that post-traumatic reactions or reactions that are very much related to the traumatic material and memories can very much coexist with a lot of resilience and even with post-traumatic growth in the same individual. And we definitely will see it in some of the examples that I'll bring you from things that 2Gs shared with us in these groups, in other groups that I ran, smaller interactive groups, and in many other settings. So just to quickly mention, post-traumatic growth includes these very important 5 areas: the recognition of one's own personal strengths just because we managed to endure and get through something that was very trying, the emphasis on the meaning of close relationships to us, which leads oftentimes to the development of much closer personal relationships, a greater sense of appreciation for life that many survivors express after having been through trauma. Also, a recognition that they have new possibilities of how to be and what to be, that they're less bound by the ways that things were defined for them before the trauma, just because having gone through something so difficult, one actually feels that that personal liberty and right to choose for themselves whatever they want, and spiritual development. All of these areas are things that people who went through terrible things, be it the Holocaust, be it POWs, say that they actually, that happened to them after and because of the traumatic events. That is not to say that anyone would want to go through the traumatic event in order to feel these gains, but these are things that people attribute to the fact that they went through these very difficult times. And these things are actually correlated with the severity of post-traumatic symptoms. So the more we suffered, the more in a way it drives people to make these meanings and to gain that kind of new appreciation for things after the end of the trauma. Now, the reactions of 2Gs to the pandemic are varied and very, very, in a way, very different. Somebody could say and said, these are quotes with permission, if you ask me how being the child of Holocaust survivors impacts my response to the current situation, I would say it helps. My standard response is, this is nothing compared to what my parents endured. And also, somebody else says, just before the pandemic was openly recognized, I had the feeling of impending disaster, like I was living in Germany before Kristallnacht. Does that make sense to you? So you see here both the apprehension and the hypersensitivity and the sense that one is hardened and strengthened and more prepared for dealing with such a situation just because our parents went through things so much more difficult and we have a different perspective. So this polarization in reactions, both the triggering of past traumatic memories and the activation of unique strengths and resiliencies, both of these were attributed by various people, second generation, very specifically to the experience of being 2G. So they actually made the connection very directly. So for example, in response, a few more examples, in response to the sharp increase in gun sales that I mentioned before, which was definitely for many of us a reminder and a scary activation of the sense of danger that lie under the surface of social order. People said, many of us said something like, we know how neighbors can turn into murderers. And that was especially in the beginning when there was a threat of scarcity and what happens to people when they start looking for food and there's no food in the stores. And yet people also said repeatedly, this is not the Holocaust. No one is trying to kill us. We are safe in our homes. We have food, we have electricity, communication, water, a sense of how different it is and how much we shouldn't make we shouldn't get too worried and fearful. Another example by the very same person who said both when the borders of Israel closed, she felt that it evoked an intense fear in her of having no access to a safe place should one need it. But at the same time, she also told her son, your grandfather lived in the woods for 2 years, you'll be okay, you'll be fine. So the polarization and the activation of both the resiliency, the hardening, and the fears and the concerns. The debate about whether there is or there isn't transmission is an ongoing debate. It's a very complicated issue, and it not only is an academic debate, it's also a debate that is very much saturated with personal attitudes. The implications of the fact that parents went through terrible traumatic, a long, terribly traumatic period during the Holocaust, the implications of that to the well-being of the second generation, the children of survivors, have actually not been even recognized until the early 70s, when children of survivors were, early adolescents, kids and early adolescents. Since then, the issue of intergenerational transmission of trauma has become the focus of research in many different populations. And yet the debate continues, very heavily loaded from all sides. Survivors didn't really want to think that they passed on any kind of pain or effects related to the trauma to their children. Children of survivors did not want to feel that we carry any kind of effects related to it. And the Germans didn't want to acknowledge it either for their own reasons. So everybody had reasons to deny it. And it took a very long time for very high quality research to accumulate. And basically, it is now accepted overall that not only in children of survivors, but also in other trauma exposed populations, there is such a thing as historical trauma that is transmitted to the children of survivors and even to further generations of descendants. And I want to talk to you about the concept that I call the dual reality of children of survivors. It's really the dual reality of survivors and of the children of survivors. My friend, my close friend and mentor, Dori Laub, said with his colleagues, Harvey Peskin and Nanette Auerhahn, put it beautifully, in my opinion, when they said, the children of survivors of the Holocaust view the world from a vantage point of a catastrophe that ravaged their family. And this point of view, this knowledge, is not an informational knowledge of the historical facts and the events, nor even of the particular factual knowledge of one's own parents' story in the Holocaust, but it's really an experiential knowledge of an event that happened before we were even born. And this knowledge of this event, this implicit knowledge of the event, is mediated through the emotional relationships with the parents. It's mediated not only in words, although sometimes in words, and I'll give you an example, I believe, in a minute, but it's also mediated in certain silences, in what the parent says and in what the parent doesn't say, and when it is that they do it, and the facial expressions, and all of those rich nuances and micro interactions that make up the emotional day-to-day relationship between children and parents in the life of a family. And Mariana Hirsch coined the term post-memory, which is a kind of a form of memory that is not like personal memory because we didn't live through it. We don't have a personal memory, but it's also very different from history because of the profound and deep emotional personal connection that one has to those events. And I wanted to share with you what I found very useful in speaking about what is this dual reality of the children of survivors. And I bring to your attention a metaphor, which I call the glass floor. So imagine that you live in a world that has a glass floor, a transparent glass floor. on top of the glass floor, you live in the here and now reality of where you were born. And we, the second generation, most of us lived in the relatively safe reality of the past 70 years before 9/11, kind of, in the States, even in Israel, in Canada, wherever we lived, in a reality that was governed by the normal rules of social desirability, how to behave nicely. Children are taught to behave well, to give the other person their turn, to even wait and give the other person the right to go ahead of us in turn, or in a queue for something, and all of those niceties of life under normal situations, normal conditions. Under the glass floor, there is, as if, those of us who like art and are perhaps familiar with the paintings by Johann Bruegel, underneath the glass floor is this catastrophic world of the trauma, of the time of the trauma, and what we know and what we have in our minds as these fragments of stories and fears and the ways people behave when the situation is governed not by socially desirable behavior, but by strictly survival. What will make one perhaps have a slightly better chance at survival for one more day, for one more hour? And in that reality, people don't give each other a turn. People shove, people push, people grab, people betray. That is a very, very different reality. And why do I say that it is a glass floor that separates between these two realities? Because I'm trying to indicate that while we live in our day-to-day, in the reality of the here and now, the relatively safe reality of the here and now, in which we expect people to behave well, and we expect basically that we can sort of trust each other and all of that. While we live on the glass floor in this reality, the reality of trauma is always somewhere in the periphery of the psychological field of children of survivors. One cannot say to oneself, it happened there, it happened then, a long time ago, it will never happen again. For children of survivors, the possibility that underneath the reality of the here and now and how people behave when everything is well, underneath it lies the reality of trauma and the way that people behave when things become difficult. And they know that it can happen anytime, or they feel that it can happen anytime. And there is a back and forth sort of background, foreground play between the reality of the trauma and the reality of the here and now. When everything is good, the reality of the here and now is dominant, but the reality of the trauma can rush forth and become the one in the foreground. It can even completely dominate or overwhelm our perception of what is happening in the here and now when it is triggered by something powerful enough. And the trigger can be something that is completely unnoticed by other people who are not sensitive to that trigger. So for example, I gave you here an example of a picture which I took down from the internet, but it is a picture that depicts something that someone told me who saw people who were hanged. And for that person, when he walks in the street and everything is just fine, but he comes across laundry like that, hanging on a string, and it's moving in the wind, for him, the trigger that is completely unnoticed by other people evokes a terrible reaction. And for him in those moments, he's completely reliving what he saw in the terrible traumatic situation where he was at the time. The same thing happens to children of survivors. And I give you here an example of this photograph, which was taken by a very close friend of mine in Austria. These are grapevines in the snow. And when you see this, oftentimes when I would show it in a large room on a large screen when there were lots of children of survivors in the audience, one could actually hear an audible gasp because our emotional reaction to this very simple and concrete stimulus is like seeing inmates of the concentration camp in the morning roll call, emaciated survivors standing in the roll call like that, and that is just to show you, if we can have such a powerful emotional reaction to something so simple as grapevines in the snow, how much more might we have an emotional reaction that comes from the reality of trauma to the shattered glass on the streets of Manhattan, to the learning in the news about the sales of guns, to all of those triggers that this last period of several months have brought forth. This is a book that I strongly recommend to second generation. The second generation, Things I Didn't Tell My Dad. It's an illustrated story of his life by Michel Kishka, who's a very, very talented Belgian-born son of survivors who lives in Israel. And I took the picture of the cover of the book, by the way, because it shows so significantly the fact that the feeling of his father's Auschwitz cap being the stage on which his life takes place. So the importance of that reality of the father's trauma as the stage for the life of his son born after the trauma ended. So some of the early findings, as I covered it in my review of the literature in 1998, which was at the time and actually still is one of the most extensive reviews of published and non-published doctoral and master's dissertations about the second generation. The findings showed that there is no psychopathology in the children of survivors as a rule, but at the same time, as a group, we don't show psychopathological syndromes at a higher rates, but we have elevated scores in a variety of areas, which are definitely different from other people who are our peers who are not related to the Holocaust. Our scores are still within the normative range, but at the very high end relative to our peers. And those elevated scores include anxiety, depressive symptoms, guilt, hypervigilance, and interpersonal sensitivity. So some of us are very easily sort of feeling slighted or offended, feelings of alienation, over and under control of aggression, namely some of us fly off the handle a little bit too easily, whereas other ones have a hard time saying, sorry, I really didn't like what you did, or no, I can't stay at work 17 hours without extra pay. And sort of some of us, that is to say, have too little capacity to be assertive and self-protective, and also a very high sense of self-criticism. Although, again, all of those things remain within the normative range, but they are higher than our peers. So think about these things. If we have higher scores in these areas before COVID-19, how do these sensitivities of ours respond to some of the triggers and difficulties and challenges that we are facing during COVID-19 and this period of the last few months? We also have very high achievement motivation, and we also have managed to accomplish very high levels of education and socioeconomic success in comparison to our non-Holocaust related peers. And we are very much overrepresented relative to our percent in the general population. We are very, very much overrepresented in the helping professions. So in the earlier studies of the second generation, participants were found to be not so different from other people, using all kinds of measures of psychological functioning and adjustment and how well we adapted to various tasks in our lives and to various challenges and our attachment styles and all kinds of things where differences were not found. And yet people who were afterwards interviewed individually often mentioned that these studies did not really tap into their experience as second generation. So more recent studies began to look at these more phenomenological, individual experiences, the subjective experiences and memories of what does it mean to people who are sampled from non-clinical samples, people who are sampled from the general population of second generation. What do they think characterize their experiences growing up in families of Holocaust survivors? And in such studies, we actually do see common psychological themes and common concerns that are shared in the memories of many, many of those highly functioning and non-clinical adults regarding how it was like growing up in their survivor parents' homes. We also find that, of course, there's a great variability. I cannot overemphasize it enough. There is a great variability in the within the group of second generations with regards to how much each of us feels that they were impacted, in which way each of us feels that we were impacted, how interested each of us is in the topics related to the Holocaust, and all of that. Great, great variability, including variability and differences in biological markers and in genetic markers that have been shown both in children of survivors and in other survivors of other traumas, such as Rwandan survivors and others. There are certain biological markers and genetic markers that suggest that some people are more sensitive than others to the same traumatic circumstances, and so are we. So some of the central themes that have been identified in studies of adult children of survivors from, as I said, from the general population, not clinical, is a great focus that they felt existed in the family atmosphere on survival themes, and also a certain sense of mistrust of non-family members or non-Jews in general, a focus on food, on hoarding stuff, supplies, a fear of shortages. Parents were perceived by many as either overreactive, so anything that happened was easily caused an overreaction, an anxious overreaction, or an angry overreaction in survivor parents, or some perceive their parents as having been closed off, or what we would call in terms of symptoms of post-traumatic disorder, numbing and detachment. And I put here the name of a book, which I feel is a beautiful book. It's called A Thread of Grace by Maria Doria Russell, which describes the experiences of a young Jewish girl with the partisans in North Italy in the mountains. And in the epilogue of the book, there's a very beautiful piece described by the rabbi of that woman when she's dying. And he talks about, you know, the way her children experienced her as so closed off and detached because of her experiences. So many of us go that way, either overreactive, memories of parents who are overreactive, or too detached and closed off, especially to happy events in the life of the children. Many people describe the need that they felt always to protect the parents, even at the cost of one's own needs or one's own wishes, not going on that class trip because mother cried for a whole week before that, or going on the class trip even though mother cried the whole week, and then feeling like a very, very bad, selfish person. Over control or under control of aggressive feelings, which I mentioned before, and wishing while growing up for more autonomy, but then feeling very much that one couldn't allow oneself to do certain things because it would cause the parents so much anxiety, and it was such a selfish thing to do. And that, you know, some of us felt very tethered and stayed very close by the parents because of the concern for the parents' well-being, while others removed or distanced themselves, and some even distanced themselves very extremely because this was the only way that they could break the power of that feeling of being so tethered to the parents. My friend and colleague Hadass Weissman from Haifa referred to a sense of failed intersubjectivity, which prevailed the atmosphere of the relationship, meaning that children of survivors often describe having felt not understood by their parents, not being able to explain themselves, not being able to be understood, not really being seen for the individual person that they were, even if the parents valued them and protected them and would do anything for their physical needs, and also not really being able to understand the parents very well. So a certain sense of not being able to understand the other person, which prevailed, and not being able to be understood fully, which was very pervasive in the relationship. And again, I asked you to think how that feeling of basic sort of, I'm never really understood and I can't really ever understand the other person, especially when there's a clash of needs, how that is enacted in our later relationships, sometimes with spouses, with adult children, and with siblings. So the early studies about the second generation were justifiably criticized for a lot of methodological flaws, but these were corrected later. And the results of very good studies and a very good meta-analytic study, which is a very sophisticated statistical way of combining the results of multiple studies. The results state, and I quote here, the weight of the evidence, emphasizing very well-designed studies, is suggesting of an association between elevated parental post-traumatic stress symptoms or post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms and the outcome in the children. So the more the parents had symptoms of post-trauma, the more effects the children felt and show and demonstrate in their own life. So by now we have several hundreds of studies of very high quality research on the children of survivors, which tell us a lot about the way that we navigated all kinds of important life stages from our adolescence, growing up, being young adults, how we navigated leaving the home of our parents, how we navigated the choices of early adulthood, about lifestyle, about marriage, about parenting, all of those things. And we definitely have sufficient evidence that shows that we navigated these various life transitions and life challenges somewhat differently than our peers. And that's why it's probably likely that our reactions to the current crises, the pandemic and everything else that goes along it, and this entire changed reality in which we all live, might also be different than those of our peers. And indeed, as I showed you in our as I discussed with you, as I shared with you, our study, Amit Shriraz and mine, definitely showed it. And what's important, very, very important for me to emphasize, is that we have a profile as a group of strengths and vulnerabilities as 2Gs. So yeah, we have certain things that we do better because of it. And unlike some personality organizations, you know, some personality organizations have certain strength in some areas and certain terribly different weaknesses in completely different areas of the individual's functioning. For example, we all know the mathematician or high-tech wizard who's very, very good at what they do in those particular fields, but are incredibly lacking in terms of their capacity for reading social cues and what we call emotional intelligence. In the second generation, it's not like that. It's not that our strengths are here and our weaknesses are there. It's more like the strengths and the vulnerabilities are the two sides of the same coin, the two sides of the same trait. So the same trait is at the same time both an asset and a liability, depending on the context and depending on the degree to which they over-determine the way that we react. So in that way, you know, the example would be we are incredibly over-empathic we grew up becoming very, very sensitive to our parents and their needs, which led many of us into the helping professions, which makes us very, very empathic to the needs of other people. We needed to put our parents' needs ahead of our own. That can be a good trait, but it can also become a liability if it is out of control, rigid, and determines our behavior or over determines our behavior, whether it's appropriate and whether it's not appropriate. We always have to put the other person's needs ahead of ourselves. Then the same trait becomes actually a burden, a liability, a vulnerability. And many of our issues are like that. So one of the things that many of us did feel was the age. All of a sudden, you know, in our generation, being 60 is kind of the new 40, right? We would like to think so, and we used to think so, until all of a sudden COVID came, and we kept hearing that people over 60 have to be much more careful and maintain social distancing much more stringently and should stay home and so forth, especially in the beginning. And all of a sudden, being 60 was a trigger. And many people mentioned something like this person that I quoted there, being targeted as older is very triggering, because feeling like a particularly targeted group for any reason is a reminder for us of the way that our parents were a targeted group, the way that being a Jew was a targeted feature. And furthermore, we all grew up also without grandparents in greatly because of the fact that people older than 50 were much less able to survive the Holocaust in any of the circumstances, in hiding in the woods or in the concentration camps. So very few people over 50 actually survived, in which case, you know, we have a certain feeling about aging that is part of our legacy, a danger. So indeed, my friend Amit Shrira and his colleagues in previous findings, in previous research, found that we have much less positive subjective perceptions of our own aging. And subjective perceptions of one's aging are a very important part of how well one will age. And that there is a pretty large and growing area of research that shows that. And we also have evidence that shows that as second generation reached middle age, we tend to have more medical conditions and issues which have been hypothesized to be related to epigenetic changes. So for example, the fact that our parents were starved for a very long time might be related to epigenetic changes that make our bodies be much more efficient at conserving all kinds of stuff. And since we don't live in a time that we are starved, it may be related to higher frequency of disorders related to prediabetes, diabetes, high cholesterol, and so forth. All of these things suggest that during a time in which access to medical care and services is threatened, and all of the issues related to less positive perceptions of our own aging might be particularly problematic aspect for us during the time of the pandemic. We also have higher scores in hypervigilance and mistrust, as I told you. And so this was very much evident in some of the things that I heard from 2Gs these days. You know, the feeling of doom, someone said. I kind of feel this is the feeling I've been expecting my whole life. It is not at all a surprise. Other people said the masks dehumanize and people seem hostile to me because of the fact that you can't see their faces. Everybody is a potential perpetrator because of the hypersensitivity that we have, because of the dual reality that we carry deep inside. And so it's like in the very famous line from this poem by Linda Paston, which I find so evocative. For Jews, Cossacks are always coming. And that's where the, gun sales, for example, was so troubling for so many of us. So a sense of alarm, or what another colleague, Dov Shmotkin from Israel, called a hostile world scenario that we carry with us, or what I call the dual reality of trauma. The sense of alarm that has often been deemed unrealistic, exaggerated, neurotic, and people just go, yeah, you always think the worst, you always worry, you always this and that. In normal life, now all of a sudden, our sense of alarm is much more consistent with the reality of the situation. And it also confers upon us in many ways a certain adaptive coping and capacity and preparedness for the situation. As you can see from some of those examples that were shared, a professional who left her job in Brooklyn before everyone thought it was necessary said, I'm viewed as the alarmist. I see things ahead. I tried to warn people. I was like the canary in the coal mine. I'm always like the canary in the coal mine, she said. The reality of trauma is always there for me. I sense the danger and sometimes it's real. And another person said, I am hardwired for emergencies. When the planes hit on 9/11, no one needed to tell me that it was terror. I didn't think for a minute, she said, that this was an accident. I knew immediately that this was terror. Another person said during COVID in the very beginning, when the mayor said it was safe to take the subway, I left New York City. I get information from many places, from subtle cues. I am good for crisis, but it doesn't translate well to times of no crisis, not for myself and not for others. So we have an alarm system as children of survivors that needs both validation. It's not crazy, it's useful, it has its upsides. It does give us some good coping capacities in difficult times. But sometimes, especially in the more normal times and in the way that it manifests itself in relationships with people close to us, it needs some tuning up. It needs some recalibration because it gets on people's nerves. So, we have as a strength, our hardiness, our resourcefulness. A lot of us know how to make something from nothing. My quote there is a direct quote from somebody who said, I can make a meal from dirt, and many of us can make a lot out of nothing and fix what's broken and use it this way and another way. And it's a capacity that makes it easier for many of us to stay home, to cook at home, to bake at home, to manage well, to do without a lot of the usual comforts of life. But at the same time, it's also sometimes related to a blind commitment to make the most of an object that really should be thrown out and disposed of, or a relationship that really isn't good to stay in. And it's not a good capacity. It's not a good it's a liability when it becomes, as I said, a blind commitment, when one actually does have a choice and should make a different choice. Now, Jenny is showing me that I have barely 5 more minutes. So I will just,
Actually, Dr. Felsen, there aren't many questions yet. So if you want to go for another 10 minutes or so, that's fine.
wonderful. So I'll do that, and then we'll see what we want to do in the interactive time. So what we also do have, as you see from these two sides of the same coin, is also the aspect of better preparedness for some of the difficulties that this time presents, a resilience and a post-traumatic growth, as I mentioned earlier, and this different perspective, whether it is that we are more sensitive to some things and more vulnerable, or whether it is that we feel this is not the Holocaust, don't be so upset. We feel that other people might not understand how we feel, how our perspective is different, whether it is that we see it, as I said, as less terrible because we have such a different perspective because of what our parents endured, which was so much harder, or whether it is because we're more sensitized. So for example, some person said, I do wish that the deaths would stop, but I enjoy being at home with the family. The capacity to recognize the precious gift that can be found even within this very difficult situation is part of a different perspective and post-traumatic growth. At the same time, as I said here, feeling that non-Holocaust related spouses and friends and others are expressing exaggerated fears and catastrophizing is also part of this different perspective. My mother survived the Holocaust. We can survive this. Many people said things like that. We talked about failed intersubjectivity, the sense of lack of being understood, lack of the ability to understand our parents, which many people feel was so pervasive in their growing up years. How does such a relational experience and such expectancies about the degree to which close people can understand each other, how is that activated during COVID-19 for us when we need each other so much more as sources of emotional support and emotional regulation, and as we are deprived of so many other ways in which we used to regulate ourselves, such as taking a walk, going to the gym, meeting up with friends, all of those other things that contribute to the ways in which we make ourselves feel better. Now we rely so much more on relationships, and how does our sensitivity with regards to failed intersubjectivity make us perhaps more vulnerable to this time? We also had, many of us felt an exaggerated sense of responsibility and role reversal with the relationship we had with our parents, a certain sense of having to parent the parents or be very aware of how they felt and taking care of them, which is such a common experience described by children of survivors. How does that now get activated and impact how we feel at a time when so many people are not doing well, when family relatives are, we can't help them, we can't go to visit them, we can't even help, sometimes some of us still have parents who are living and are, we can't take care of them in the same way that people did before COVID. How does that get activated in us? What do we feel, and how does it impact our own well-being? So another point that I wanted to mention, as I put there in the bottom in red, it's very, very important to limit our exposure to people who are, and to the media, people who are catastrophizing, and to the media, because the over empathic capacities that have been very much sensitized in many of us can make people very sensitive to the overexposure, such as this person said, I'm extremely empathic, so to an extreme, to a scary degree. I can't hear about other people's tragedies without crying. I can't expose myself to it. She's been kind of hyper sensitized and up to here and can't really deal with it anymore. And we need to give ourselves permission to titrate and regulate the degree to which we listen to the tragedies around. Some people feel that it's very difficult to compare oneself to our parents. Our parents survived so much worse, and anything that we're going through right now cannot compare with it and pales in the comparison. And that, of course, is true. But at the same time, it's very important to be aware of the fact that some of those things that are part of our dual reality are activated in us. We do have a right to our own experiences and our own feelings as children of survivors, even though nobody claims that they are anywhere near the experiences of our parents who survived the Holocaust. But we still do have the echoes of that trauma, and many of us feel them quite significantly. And so to be aware of it, to give ourselves permission to acknowledge it, and to be more compassionate with yourself and with others around you right now, to try and validate your own feelings and try to find mirroring, as we call it, validation and acceptance of it in other people where you can get it. So if you feel you cannot get it with some people, it's very important to find right now those people with whom you can get that kind of validation and mirroring. And for example, this is what we are doing right now with each other, validating our experiences as children of survivors with all of the differences and all of the variability that exists amongst us and within our different experiences. But we do share this very unique legacy. We do share various flavors of the effects of intergenerational transmission. And it's extremely important to validate each other, to validate that this is a difficult and unique time in which we might respond differently than others, and to be with people who can understand each other, such as perhaps in a way, a group like this. I think I'll stop here, even though there are some other things we can say, but let me see. Of course, the separation from the elderly parents, I touched upon it. It's a very painful aspect for many of us, of those who still have parents who are living. And because separations were such a loaded issue in our own families of origin, it also is very, very difficult for many second generations to be so far away and removed from the usual level of contact that they have with their own children, the third generation, and with the grandchildren, the fourth generation. And indeed, there is a trade-off between the positive side and the negative side of our traits. And I wanted to give you here an example. I think I said something similar before, but it's very, very important that we recognize it, especially now when we are with our spouses or with certain family members, actually more than ever before, and the other ones a lot less. I seem to drive my family crazy, someone said, as I'm extremely diligent about distancing and all of the other precautions. They say I'm overdoing it. My mom was the same way about everything in life. Is that which I'm accused of common to other 2Gs? Yes, to some extent, of course. And indeed, there is a trade-off between the advantages that make us better prepared for a difficult time and the cost of such chronic preparedness in terms of the quality of life and relationships during normal times, and even during these times. So someone else said, I seem to be having an easier time adjusting to the limitations of the stay at home, having to wear the mask if you have to go out, and sanitizing everything than those who do not share my family's background. Or someone else said, it's my experience and observation that many of us 2Gs are faring better emotionally than others. We are accustomed to extreme situations of threat and danger. The real challenge is how do we live in more normal times? And I think this is what I would like to emphasize. You know, we have to become aware of those strengths and the advantages that they give us and the vulnerabilities or liabilities that they bring with them, so that we can work on calibrating it more appropriately depending on the context, depending on what we want to do in our relationships with those closest to us. I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Dr. Felsen, thank you so very, very much. We did get a few more questions, and I know that we could still talk quite a bit about ways to maybe deal with some of these concerns that 2Gs may have.
Yes.
But let's take some questions and sort of see where that goes. So one of the questions is slide related. Can you go back to slide 36, which was just recently? And someone asked if you could put that back on and maybe talk a little bit more about this.
So
Sorry, it's not 36. It was separating from parents.
this.
It was yes, separating. Yes, excuse me, separating from parents. Yes.
Yeah, so separations in our families were a very difficult thing, and moving out. But even before that, many of us remember that it was even difficult, as I mentioned before, to go on a class trip, or to go anywhere, or to move far away from the parent, or to not. All separations were more complicated. And they colored the way that we second generation perceived any kind of actual or perceived separations. Actual separations being when we really did have to go far away from parents, and perceived separations meaning any kind that was perceived as such. Like, sometimes it's about someone who can see his parents or his elderly parent every week, but then the one holiday that they decide to go away, how that is perceived is not really it's not just about the actual act, but how it is perceived by the second generation. Sometimes it can be something that evokes a lot of guilt, a lot of bad feelings, even though someone else looking from the side would say, what are you feeling so guilty? Why is it so difficult for you? You're such a good son, or you're going there every week. So separations were a very fraught issue in our families. And therefore, now when social distancing has prevented actual contact with one's family, with elderly survivors, with children, with grandchildren, given that we have such a sensitivity around separations, it's very difficult for us, perhaps more than for other people who didn't grow up with such a loaded sort of emotional burden around separation from our parents. I wanted to take the opportunity, Jenny, if there aren't too many questions, I would like to say a few things about some of the ways that we can help ourselves in this time. But
okay, there are a few more questions.
Good, so give me the questions.
Okay. One is related directly to where you're going. How can we become less sensitive? So that's
less what?
Sensitive. So that's a good segue to where you're going. But there are two questions that are somewhat related. With all the research into 2G trauma and triggers, are you or anyone in the field sharing information with other PTSD generations that can sort of take us forward into the future as one cooperative humanity?
Yes, of course. I think that right now here in our meeting, we're focusing on the second generation and on descendants of survivors. But definitely there has been, thankfully, a convergence of a lot of things in research into families of Holocaust survivors has informed research in many, many other trauma-exposed populations and shorten the time between their trauma and the existence of good studies, good research, and therefore also the offering of appropriate interventions in many cases. Certainly, certainly. You're not hearing you.
Thank you. And I would just give a plug that the organization International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma is also doing a lot of work around different population groups.
Right, and there was the book in which I had the chapter reviewing the studies about second generation, which are mentioned from 1998, is actually edited by Yael Danieli and called the International Handbook, or the Handbook of International Legacies of Multi-Generational Trauma. And it has chapters about various populations. There's also a special issue of the Journal of Aggression and something else, which changed his name afterwards, but I can give it to you if anybody is interested. Special issue about multi-generational legacies of trauma in different populations. There's a lot of research about it now, a lot.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And so it's somewhat related is how can you describe 2G, 3G, and other survivors that do not feel empathy and may side with leaders who seem to mimic the worst of humanity?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Who do not feel empathy and
side with leaders who seem to mimic the worst of humanity.
Well, this is a very, very difficult time. 3 days before the elections here. And I don't know to which extent some of you are following what's going on in Israel. It's not much better there. And in many other places, I was just talking to a friend from the Philippines. I mean, there are a lot of difficult issues around. And without becoming in any way, without speaking to the politics of the next 3 days here, I just want to say that, we need to understand that we have different ways of looking at things. Many, many, many different things can be seen in very different ways by people who are on the other side of the issue. And the question is, let me say very, very much more clearly what I want to say. When I was a student in Hamburg, I just came there from Israel. I just started working there. I took a cup of coffee, my cup of coffee, and I went to the departmental kitchen to wash it. And I washed it with soap. At the time in Germany, there was the Grüne party, the Green Party, very, very powerful sort of a force that was rising in favor of, environmentalism and pacifism and all of these wonderful ideas. And a friend of mine who actually was very friendly towards me, a German guy, saw me washing the cup with soap and said, don't do that. Don't do that. How can you do that? You don't need to environmentally. It's enough that you just rinse it. And I got all, like this. And I did not. I was like, I'm sorry. I guess you have the same reaction. I can understand your reaction. I come from Israel where there is no water. And when I see sometimes people in the summer washing their cars with the garden hose and wasting a lot of water, I have the same reaction. And you know what he said to me, this very lovely environmentalist, pacifist guy? He said to me, people like that should be put to the wall and shot. So what I want to say to you is that the history of trauma can make us very, how shall I say, we have to be careful about not being too judgmental in any way that we think the subject is divided. So one can become, if you like, how shall I say, one can become actually fascist or very not humane by thinking that we have the right idea, whichever idea that is. And I think the most important thing for us as children of survivors is to understand that we have to work towards better intersubjective understanding, the opposite of failed intersubjectivity. We have to understand that we always have to find the way to discuss things in a non-divisive way, to go against divisive ways of treating any subject, because from any side of the issue, if we think that we have the only right way and that the other people are awful, we're not going to solve a problem. And some of us, I think, and I can totally understand how that can happen, fear, misconstrued ideas, in my opinion, misconstrued of what is necessary in order to keep us safe, can make people do desperate things and support desperate causes. And I think that we have to educate everybody that we can about the importance of dialogue and the importance of human rights from every side of the issue, of everybody's human rights from every side of the issue. I hope that that was an answer to the question.
Thank you, and it's a very complicated one, so I appreciate your response to that. Well, we actually are out of time, but maybe you would like to offer that if anybody does want some additional information specific to sort of taking care of oneself, maybe they could be in touch with you directly.
So I will just remind you, Jenny, we have in the previous time that we did our conversation on this, we actually shared with people a few slides about behavioral cognitive ways of managing anxiety in the moment. So the immediate management of anxiety in the moment. We also talked a little bit about these ways here, the ways to focus on some, and there's a lot of material. If you look at management of anxiety or behavioral cognitive management of anxiety, there's a lot of material online, but we'll be happy to share these slides with people who want to. And I also definitely will touch upon some of these things that I didn't get to today here in other conversations, but I will close with my 3 C's, which are very important at this time and are actually very important always when we want to strengthen our strengths and not our weaknesses. The 3 C's that I refer to are: look always for what you can control and focus on those plans that are under your control, those things that you can control, even if we're now in our own homes. What can we do that we control? Enhances our sense of well-being. Creativity is very, very important. If there's anything that you like doing or anything that you wanted to do that you didn't have time to do, any form of creativity is part of the stuff that makes us, feel like we do have control and we can do things. Connection is very, very, very important in these times. I cannot overemphasize it. So connect with people, connect with them in every way that is possible these days. And those are my 3 C's, which are definitely important in COVID times, but also important in other times. And when we talk again about middle age as an opportunity, that's where we will focus a lot on how to enhance some of our strengths and how to counter some of our weaknesses in ways that are not specifically related to COVID, but simply as part of how to enhance our quality of life in the present and future chapters of our life.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And the person who had asked those questions about humanity actually really appreciated your answer and acknowledges that it is about really being able to dialogue. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you
so
for
much.
thank you for another wonderful webinar, Dr. Felsen. We look forward to many more through February. And to everyone who joined us this evening, thank you so much. Be safe. Take care.
Thank you. Be well, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Thank you. Bye.